So, Julian Fellowes, I have to congratulate you on an astonishing 63 hours of television with Downton Abbey. You single-handedly you created this. You wrote, I think, every script on your own, but perhaps what, 2 in the first season? Is that right?
Well, yes. I mean, they were very, very nice women, both of them. But we were trying to experiment to see if that was realistic, if the show went on. But in the end, although they were very, very talented and good, and they had very good ideas, they couldn't quite get the rhythm. And so I ended up basically redoing those scripts, and then we never tried again.
But
so I did everything.
I mean, it's you're in Los Angeles right now. You go to any show's writer's room. I mean, it's packed with people. This is you sitting down. It's staggering. I mean, it's a sort of a 3-hour film. I'm so curious as a sort of a would-be writer myself. Your process. I mean, first of all, something as mundane as, is it at a computer? Is it longhand? How do you actually do your writing?
No, I always write at a computer because I think it looks more believable. When it's just scribbled on a piece of paper, it looks like me being mad. Whereas on a screen, in all the proper sort of print, I look at it and think, oh, this looks really like a script. And so I sort of convince myself.
Now, I know that sort of, I hear stories of it. So Downton somehow is connected to your first screenplay, Gosford Park, which you win the Academy Award for. How does Gosford lead to Downton?
Well, Gosford is a colder, a more cynical place than Downton, but it was the first exploration of that kind of Alton-esque multi-story, multi-narrative, some funny, some sad, some long, some short, and so all platted up together. And it had very much taken the fancy of Gareth Neame, the producer. And he said to me over dinner, he said, would you ever go back into Gosford territory for television? And that was the sort of base of the idea of Downton. And I thought about it, and funny enough, I wasn't all that keen actually at the beginning, because I sort of felt that people would see it as asking for a second helping of the same piece of pie, But anyway, in the end, I did come round to it. We had to go back 20 years because obviously one of the sort of under layers of Gosford was that it was all coming to an end, and that the audience knew that this way of life for most people was not going to survive the Second World War. But you can't start a series at the end. So we went back from 32 to 1912. And then we picked up the same pattern of these multi-layer, multi-narrative. But I think Downton is warmer than Gosford Park. I think we like the people more. I think they're kinder, they're more decent. And in the end, we sort of want to get involved with them more. Whereas Gosford was a one-off and was on the whole about damaged people, really.
And I think what's interesting, especially for American audiences who watch it on PBS, a non-commercial station, is that in England, where it originates, it's on the commercial network. I think you ask most people, they would assume it was BBC. So when you were writing that first series, which was a mini series, because it was a complete story into itself, is there a slightly different rhythm because you've got to write in for the commercial breaks?
No, I wouldn't say that really. I mean, ITV was very supportive of the show right from the start, and they really let me and Gareth Neame and Liz Trubridge, the three of us, make the show. They didn't really sometimes they had notes and everything, but they weren't at all bullying. I mean, we didn't have to do them if they didn't want them. And with the commercials, they want to have a certain length of time of drama and then a commercial break, but it's not exact. So you look at the finished show and you decide where the breaks come. And if it would be much better if they came half a minute earlier, they don't fight that. They allow that. So actually, the acts of the piece are not completely regular. They do vary slightly according to the narrative and how the commercial breaks fit.
Oh, that's fascinating. Because now, and as you write it and sort of think, well, that's it. And then it suddenly explodes on both sides of the Atlantic. I mean, that obviously you hope it's going to take off. It's going to, connect. But how surprised were you that it's at the level that it was embraced?
Well, of course, you hope it's going to have liftoff, but you have to cover yourself. I mean, the last scene of the first series, which is that one when they're at a garden party at Highclere and at whatever it's called, Downton, and then they announce the First World War breaking out, which was actually taken from part of my own history. My father, as a child, as a 2-year-old little boy, was at a garden party at a house called Hurstbourne Park, and someone came out on the terrace and made the band be quiet and said, "Ladies and gentlemen, I regret to inform you that we're at war with Germany." And that was his first memory. And I said to him afterwards, why do you think that was? Why did it stick in your mind? He said, because I think there must have been such an emotional jolt that went through the company, through the guests, through the servants, through the band, that even a 2-year-old child could pick it up. Anyway, I took that scene because I knew it might have to be the last scene of the whole thing. So it had to stand as the finish of the story. And then the audience would say, oh, yes. And then the First World War came and everything was different. And that's the end. Because we weren't sure we'd get a second series at that point. I mean, obviously, having said that, I thought the show was very good when we finished it. I was very proud of it. I was very pleased with it. But you never know. And I hoped we would get a second series. I thought it was quite likely because I thought it had turned out well. But of course, obviously, we didn't have the first idea that we were heading into this kind of whirlwind where we were going to have this enormous reception, first in America, which was, fantastic and tremendously rewarding, and then all over the world and China, It's very strange, really. I mean, what do the Chinese make of Violet, Dowager Countess of Grantham? I don't know, but
there's
it sort of worked everywhere it went.
There's one in every, I think, all around the world. There is that tart-tongued grandmother. I mean, that.
Well, I think you're right. And actually, one of the very nice things that came out of the show was I realized that in Violet, without knowing it, I had represented a kind of iconic figure in our world society, because everyone, every nationality, every class, every part of the country, people would come up to me and say, whenever I watch that Maggie Smith character, I think you must have known my Auntie Maud. I think you must have known my granny. I think you must have known my Auntie Edna. And you realize that this tough, unyielding, steering woman who got the family through dramas but had a sort of kind heart, in fact occurred. And my own theory now is that it was because I grew up after the war, in those early years after the war, and in many families of every kind, when the men had gone off to fight, it was the mother figure, the matriarch, who actually kept the show on the road and kept everything proper and happening and didn't let everything go to the dogs. And so many, many families who grew up in the 50s and 60s remember these matriarchal figures. And I loved that. I loved the sense that I touched something very kind of diurnal in our society.
Well, right. I mean, we were talking before about Coronation Street. I mean, she's the Ina Sharples of Downton. I mean, that.
She is, Ina Sharples of Downton.
Yeah. That now Maggie Smith. I mean, 2 Oscars, Tony, Emmys, all of these things. I mean, she's Oscar nominated for Gosford. She ends up in Downton. But has she forgiven you in that she's completely lost her anonymity now? I mean, this show is global. I mean, at this, in her 70s, she's now better known around the world than she ever was. I guess between Harry Potter and Downton, she can't go anywhere.
Well, I agree with you. I think it was fine. I have to touch something to get it to go away. Oh, is there anyone there? Can you make this go away? I've got a sudden block on your face, so I can't see your face. Do you know how to get that out? Oh, okay. No, I I'm not sure we've done Maggie such a favor, because in many ways, the career she had before Downton, where she was tremendously highly respected, given all the awards, every honor, every this, every that. She was a dame, she had an Oscar, everything. But she could go shopping.
That's
and
right.
on the whole, you know, sometimes people would say, oh, how much I admire you. But she was more or less left alone to get on with her own life. And now Downton has given that tremendous fame, which is a mixed blessing, really. I mean, I think it's the price she's paid. I hope she's enjoyed the show. And of course, she is very emblematic of the show. But I think it is quite difficult, that.
So, and in fact, I think in the last episode, I mean, she has the last line, right? But now with the Emmys, you know, writing all these hours and all these, you have to sort of pick one, and you've picked the penultimate episode to submit to the TV Academy. And I'm so curious, like, why that versus the finale? How, it's like picking your children, your favorite child, I suppose.
In this, I tend to be guided by the judgment of Gareth and others, because I feel I'm too close. You have these lines you love, and your man, all the rest of it. And really, that isn't what picking an episode is about. It's about the overall episode. Does it make you cry? Does it make you laugh? Does it involve you? And all the rest of it. And in the end, Gareth felt that the best one was 8, which had its mixture of tears and laughter. And, you know, I went along with that because I feel he's probably a better judge than I am, really.
And in England, I mean, that was the one where sort of Mary sabotages Edith's engagement. And then the English viewers had to wait about 6 weeks for Christmas Day. I mean, that was your Christmas gift to your homeland, is to get that Edith. I mean, you must have had 6 weeks of people begging you that Edith was going to find happiness, right?
Well, I had this wonderful thing, which I was told about on Facebook or Twitter or one of those, you know, and it said, if Edith Crawley isn't happy at the end of the last episode, Julian Fellowes had better sleep with one eye open. So I realized there was a lot of pressure, but I wanted Edith to be happy at the last. I felt she'd earned it. We'd earned it. We'd gone uphill and down dale with her and used up at least a box of Kleenex. And I think it was fine that she was happy at the end. But in the wrecking of, I mean, Mary did wreck the engagement, but it wasn't quite as simple as that, because Edith, by concealing the child, had really lied. And she herself said to whoever asked her, oh, maybe he would have forgiven the child. She said, no, he would have forgiven the child, but he wouldn't forgive my having lied to him and not having trusted him. And I felt that was a true point. I felt Edith was in the wrong, moving towards marriage without being honest and without telling him the real situation. So although I think Mary was being a cow in deliberately trying to upset it, nevertheless, I don't think she would have been successful if Edith had not, in fact, made herself vulnerable by behaving wrongly, which Edith herself recognized. So I thought all that worked morally, if you know what I mean.
And now, when you sort of sit down and you write, and knowing it's the final season, do you know where it's ending? Like, before you start scene 1 of episode 1, you know where it's going to end?
Yes. We used to have these sort of meetings. Gareth, Liz Trubridge and I would sit and talk about the stories that were coming in that year's series and where they would finish. Obviously, some of the route was left unplanned so that, you know, things could change when you're actually writing something, and some of the smaller stories were not planned. But the rest of it would be kind of mapped out. Then we'd go to ITV, and they were normally pretty good, actually. But I remember one year we had a storyline that was exactly the same as the storyline coming up in Mr. Selfridge. So we had to cut it and think of something else. But, you know, that would be the only kind of reason they would nix anything. And then it was my job to get on and write it.
But the, you know, that probably, you ended up coming up with something else and even better. Like, I think about Dan Stevens leaving at the end of series 3, and in a way, I mean, we were all sad, but it became a gift for you as a writer that you got, now Mary's a whole different character, you know, in that.
Well, it made Michelle's job much more interesting, because nothing is less than happiness on screen, and extended happiness is absolutely exhausting. So you immediately have to start inventing problems. Whereas by killing him and then having a 6-month gap as in the story, so that people are starting to think it's time she pulled herself together, then you get into a completely different trajectory for Mary, which was actually much more interesting to play. And Michelle, I think, played it very, very well, and her sort of tentative steps back into the romantic world and all of that stuff, I thought worked very well. I mean, I'm sorry Dan came out. I would have liked him to be there all the way through, but I don't blame him. I mean, actors must go with their instinct in this thing. And he felt it was time. He'd had an offer on Broadway. He'd had an offer of a movie. That was fine. Good luck to him, say I.
Well, it's interesting when you talk about extended happiness, because and I know people ask you probably since you announced that the series was ending, about the film. And I know you've talked about sort of assembling a Rubik's Cube of trying to get all those actors together. You have a kernel of an idea for a film script, though, right, for Downton?
Yes, I do have a kind of idea, and I think it would be fun. I'm not anti the film at all. I'm very pro it. I think it'd be fun. We could be painting on a bigger canvas with broader strokes. We need a slightly different narrative structure for a film, I think, but all of that would be interesting to experiment with. And I believe that the actors, I mean, I'm probably deluded, but because they're my children, you never know what your children are up to, really. But I think they would enjoy it. I think they'd want to come back and do a film. So really, it's just down to NBC Universal and the various forces of good that govern our lives to decide when it's going to happen.
Well, look, I mean, you've got the original screenplay Oscar. So now, because Downton already exists, it would be an adapted screenplay Oscar. You got the Emmys for Downton. And I'm looking at your resume now. There could well be a Tony in your future. I can't believe that the man that created Downton Abbey did the book for something called School of Rock.
School of Rock.
Yeah. So I mean,
I loved it. I was a really happy job. Andrew Lloyd Webber came to me. He bought the rights of the film. I already knew the film very well because my son is absolutely crazy about it. And I'd watched it 2 or 3 times and I loved it. And I thought it was a great idea for a stage musical. But also, of course, as you can understand, it was a long way from, Downton. And it was a lovely excuse to get miles away and do a rock musical about children. It's very funny and these fantastic children in it. I mean, I think it's a terrific. Have you seen it?
Oh gosh, yeah, it's one of the most. It's such fun. I mean,
I really enjoyed doing it, and the kids were so fantastic. When I first was given the job, I thought that the children were going to have to be made older, like teenagers, because of the musical skills required live. And I arrive at the first rehearsal, and there they all are, these little munchkins running around. I felt like Dorothy, coming out of the house, and it was just so exciting. These tiny children playing these huge instruments. And I just felt the whole show was so warm and so enjoyable. And Alex Brightman, I think, is fantastic. A really marvelous performance. So, I was delighted to be proud of it. Very proud of it now.
And I mean, you don't, School of Rock, it sort of has been a film. I mean, your first book for a musical, Mary Poppins. I mean, you're not intimidated. I know adaptations on screen of Vanity Fair, a Thackeray novel, on television, a Trollope novel, Dr. Thorne, and now you're also doing 2 more books this year, right, for musicals, Half a Sixpence and Wind in the Willows. I mean,
yeah.
So what does intimidate you? Because I mean, tackling sort of the classics doesn't. What about this new thing you've got, which is sort of modeled on Dickens, this new serialized novel? Did that intimidate you? Belgravia.
Well, that thing came. Iran's my publisher. And they said they had this idea of mixing a 19th century method of release, a kind of 1 chapter a week, like, Dickens and Thackeray and George Eliot all did. Only theirs was printed in journals, whereas mine was going to be released on the internet, on your whatever, and come onto your iPlayer and your iPhone and your everything else. And then you had an app, and you would go on and you could learn more about the historical events and more about the period and more about different references in the text and so on. And I just thought it was kind of exciting to be the first person to do this mixture of 19th and 21st century narrative release. You know, I was very flattered to have been invited. I mean, I'm not a natural technological wizard. You know, I can barely work a tin opener in my real life. So it was kind of fun to be working with an app on the internet. And I just thought it was a laugh, I guess. I mean, the book itself is sort of my territory. It's a love story, period love story, set mostly in the 1840s. Starts actually in 1815 at the famous ball given by the Duchess of Richmond just before Waterloo. But then it goes forward to 1841. You know, it's like each reading rather than changing your life. But it just seemed to me fun to do that and to play in all these different kind of playgrounds to the ones that.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, you know, and I smile when I was, again, doing my research that, you know, for Gosford Park, you got a BAFTA nomination as Best Newcomer, you know, that, but and that was your first foray into writing after being an actor and having been, so do you ever sort of think, oh, should I have started this earlier, this writing lark?
Well, you know, I think on the whole, if you get to Rome, you must have taken the right road. And maybe that was the right time for me. Maybe that was when the audience was ready for the stuff I do. And if I'd been banging away 15 years, got anywhere.
Well, there's certainly, we're ready for more Downton if it can come, or the Gilded Age, where, I mean, I know that's been sort of on your back burner for a long time. Is it moving more closer to the front, this series for NBC?
Yes, I'm now up to my neck in research for the Gilded Age. It is an extraordinary period of American history, you know. It's really interesting because all of these vast fortunes in gas, in mining, in shipping, in railways, more than anything really, had suddenly come about after the Civil War, Summer's War, and these enormously rich people paying no income tax at that time sort of descended on New York and decided they would make their mark in New York society, and they built these palaces up and down Fifth Avenue and all around the Upper East Side. And old New York, you know, the old descendants of the kind of English, British, and Dutch families that had settled there originally in the 16th and 17th, 18th centuries. You know, they'd lived their quiet domestic lives in Washington Square, and it was all very proper and in a way rather puritanical. Were suddenly faced by these people, these neo-Renaissance princes who were gathering paintings and furniture and architecture and this and that, the other, and living anything but puritanically. And these two cultures kind of, in a sense, collided, but then collaborated to produce that society at the end of the 19th century that made New York kind of celebrated across the world. And, you know, I think it's a very interesting backdrop for a family saga, which is what it will be. Family, their servants, and so on. I mean, my, you know, stamping ground, but set against this extraordinary, I mean, too much has been demolished. I hope I can be forgiven for being critical, but it's a pity the New Yorkers didn't wake up to what they got a little earlier, because in the 20s, 30s, 40s, and 50s, so many of these astonishing houses were demolished. But some, you know, you go to the Frick and you see what the kind of building that once lined the avenue.
That's right.
It makes you cry in that way, of course, but, you know, you can get a taste of what it was. And I think it's interesting to show people about this amazing period that really is not that long ago.
And I think if my math is right, you know, Violet Crawley and Robert, I mean, it would be about the right age, you know, because I mean, I sort of in my head have it that maybe they brought him over to find himself a rich American to save Downton in the long run with her fortune.
Well, we'll have to see when we start the series and where we end up. I mean, in 1880, Robert would have been about 12.
Mm-hmm.
and then he got married, or maybe 13, 14. And then we think he got married in about 1890, and Mary was born in 1891. That's how it works.
Right.
So that she was 21 in 1912 in the first series. And so we'll have to see. It's quite a fun idea. I mean, someone once said to me, will we see any of these characters? And I said, well, most of them would be children, and the girls wouldn't be born, but would be a young man, and Violet would be. I think if Violet had been to America, we'd already know it, if you know what I mean.
That's true. You're right. Well, we'll see. But regardless, I'm sure it'll be a delight. And certainly, thank you for taking the time to talk to us, and thank you for Downton Abbey. I mean, really.
Oh, you're nice. Thank you.
63 hours of really just wonderful. And I know Maggie Smith has the box set and may one day look at it. And I would encourage anyone else to just sit down and block out a week and watch the whole thing again. So
I think one day we should Maggie on the program, but we better not hold our breath before she watches it.